how can we determine, in which exact way to interpret the Bible, and how do we reconcile the fact that there's very many different possible interpretations of it, a lot of them which could be, they could conflict with one another. Like there could be some people that very strictly believe that they are literal statements being made in many of the parts of the Bible. There's others that are saying like it's, they're parables or they're metaphors like the door, etc. So how can we sort of just objectively know, well, God meant us to literally believe, literally these things happened, I literally rose from the dead, I didn't just figuratively rose from the dead, in all the different sorts of statements that the Bible makes. How are we supposed to know, well, that's a parable part, this other part, that's a literal part, which we need to believe as literal fact?
Well, due to the fact that you're asking an excellent question, obviously points you to the fact that you got to study literary genre. I'm glad that it's a concern of yours. But the obvious answer to you, sir, is because it is a concern, you owe it to yourself as a thinking human being to study literary style. And then to learn to distinguish when Jesus is telling a parable, when he's using hyperbole, a strong form of speech, like when he says, I tell you the truth, unless you hate your father and mother, your wife and children, you cannot be my disciple. And you read in context and you understand hyperbole. He's not calling me literally to hate mom and dad and wife and children, but my love for him is to be so high and intense that my love for my family is to pale into hatred when it's compared to my love for him. And you arrive at that when you understand hyperbole, which is an extreme form of speech to make a point. And so obviously Jesus uses hyperbole.
Well, I think the problem that I feel with interpreting the Bible and reading it like a work of literature, and the different literary techniques being used in it. I think the problem with that is that it really is up to interpretation, just like all literature is. Just like Shakespeare is up to interpretation, and therefore, especially when we're prescribing the way in which we should behave and act in life based on, the literature of it, and the fact that, in some people's estimation, it could be telling us to live this way, and others a different way, and especially when it's, decisive things such as calling some things out as being morally reprehensible, such as homosexuality, or, a lot of other minor things which most Christians don't sort of, that I'm aware of, they don't take as seriously, such as like shellfish, or sort of the kind of cliched parts of the Bible which people reference, which sound silly, but that are in there. But it's essentially, so yes, that's what I'm saying. Like how are we supposed to build a moral principle on something which can be interpreted in any way? And you would argue not in any way, I think, but well, that's a question.
All right, thanks for raising it. If I say I love Christ and I believe in Jesus and I hate him, what would you call me?
I'm not nothing in particular.
Okay.
Term comes up.
Thank you. Hypocrite. Okay? I think that's pretty simple. I think down deep all of us have an understanding that if I say I believe in Christ and I hate him, and if I take out a gun and blow him away, murder him, then I'm a flaming hypocrite. Why? Because I think Mark Twain put it real well when he said, it's not the parts of the Bible I don't understand that disturb me, it's the parts of the Bible I do understand that disturb me. You're right, sir, when it comes to some of the Levitical laws, like not eating shellfish, there can be some challenges in interpretation. We agree. Difficult. Sir, on the basics, Jesus Christ is all too clear. Love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Hold to the 10 commandments. Not 100 commandments, 10 commandments. One of those is don't steal. Another one is don't lie. Another one is don't covet. Why? Because that's the antithesis of love. If I love you, I'm not going to steal from you. If I love you and respect you, I'm not going to lie to you. And if I love you and respect you, I'm not going to covet all that you have. Instead, I'm going to thank God that you have what you have and that I have what I have. I'm going to live a life of contentment. So, sir, I think Mark Twain hit the nail on the head when he said, it's not the parts of the Bible I don't understand that disturb me. It's the parts of the Bible that I do understand that disturb me. On the basics, on the fundamentals, the Bible's all too clear. Are there difficult passages? Leviticus.
Right.
Predestination, free will. Yes, sir, there are difficult passages. But let's not get derailed by the fact that there are difficult passages.
Okay, so if I understand, you're essentially saying we should take the core message of the Bible and the ideas of the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule, loving thy neighbor as thyself, and things like that. Okay, so what about specifically the issue of homosexuality? I believe that the Bible states that it's like a detestable thing, or I don't want to misquote it, but I'm pretty certain that it's against homosexuality. And how can we, is that one of the parts that is like the shellfish part, something that we can, sort of interpret not in a super literal way, or can we, and the reason I ask specifically about that is because it's something that directly, opposes the view of the many, millions of people in this country have, and that are, they aren't acting maliciously. They're acting consensually, their actions, and so by what measure should they be condemned as this being a detestable act? Just because, like many other things, like shellfish, Leviticus examples, tattoos are supposed to be detestable, etc. If you work on the Sabbath, you should be put to death, things like that. So why, and we sort of laugh at many of those things, but homosexuality is extremely, that issue of it being condemned by Christians is central to millions of people, like at least, something like 6 to 8% of the population is homosexual or bisexual. So that's millions of people that are directly opposed by that belief. So how do you defend it?
Well, what I've heard you say is Jesus Christ contradicts what millions of Americans believe about homosexuality. Yeah. And Jesus Christ contradicts even more millions of Americans when it comes to adultery and fornication. And Jesus Christ contradicts even more millions when it comes to loving money. So you're right. Jesus Christ has this uncanny way of contradicting what a lot of Americans believe.
Okay, I suppose I would make a difference, I would strike a distinction between those, and that the ideas of greed, someone is hurt, or what was the other example you just made?
Adultery and fornication.
Fornication, when someone is cheated on, their feelings are hurt, they're personally betrayed, etc. With homosexuality, I guess I'm trying to sort of find a logical basis for why homosexuality is wrong, and why to you it's different than just the shellfish part, which doesn't really make sense, and many of us don't pay attention to it. Why isn't homosexuality part seen in the same way? The Bible says many things. That's we're just going to take the core message of love that Jesus espouses. So, does Jesus say anything directly about homosexuality? I guess that's one question. Assuming that he does, and that he says that it's wrong, and it's not just one of the Old Testament parts. Independent of that, what's the logical basis for something which is consensual and no one is harmed in it? No one is literally directly harmed. I guess you could argue that, it harms society. Maybe that would be a position. But what's your take on that?
All right.
What's your logic?
The reason that homosexual sex is morally wrong is because in the same way that God created our lives for a purpose, life is not meaningless. It's been given us by God for the purpose of loving and worshiping Him and loving and serving each other. So our sexuality is not meaningless. It's not an accident. Our sexuality has been given us by God for a purpose. And that purpose is outlined in Genesis 2:24. We read, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Very clearly, a positive statement about sexuality, that God created it to be enjoyed between a man and a woman within the context of a lifelong commitment. Which means heterosexual lust, pornography, homosexuality, bestiality are all examples of twisting the purpose for which God gave us that gift of sex, for one man and one woman within the context of a lifelong commitment to enjoy sex in that context. So that's why homosexuality is wrong because it's a twisting of the purpose for which God gave us our human sexuality.
Okay, so why is God's opinion right and our opinion is wrong?
Because God's the creator. I'm not the
You're
creator.
asserting that? Well, first of all, you're asserting that God exists at all. But why? How are you going to convince me his opinion is right and mine is wrong? What's the basis for that? Because obviously I don't think it is. So how can you how are you so positive, and how do you convince me that no, God is right? Okay, here's a way to rephrase it. Our essentially is an action immoral? It's morally, or let's do the other way around. Is an action morally right because God commands us to do it, or does God command us to do actions which are morally right? If that makes sense.
Makes total sense. It's a dilemma that you've set up very well.
Well, yeah, it's absolutely.
Now, there's a third option that you're forgetting. And that third option is that God is an eternal being whose nature is good, which means his will be right. There's an eternal being, God, whose nature is good, which means his will always be right.
Well, okay, so just a quick interjection. Is he eternally good and his will right because he says that it's right? Or is it because it is right? Do you know what I'm saying? Like the actual composition of what his beliefs are, what his...
The composition
are they
of
right
God's
things?
nature is goodness and holiness. That is why his will is always right. He's an eternal being. In other words, there wasn't a standard before God that God had to live up to. And also, God does not just arbitrarily decree what's right and wrong. The dilemma that you set up is a real dilemma. But the problem is you've ignored the third option. And the third option is that God is an eternal being whose nature throughout eternity is good and just, which means his will, his decrees, his word is good and right.
Okay, so the third option, it seems to me that it's kind of just taking the first of the two options and it's just sort of changing it a little bit. Like the first option, something is right just because God says that it is. Like that's one of the options. You're saying, well, no, he just is good, but what is the difference between those two? Because in either one, what does good mean? You're kind of just changing it. You're putting it onto God. You're just saying, well, no, it's not that God says these good things. He just is good. But in either of those cases, we don't know what good is. Okay, and so just to kind of get to a point, people may be totally confused about what I'm trying to say. The idea is that things, in my opinion, things can be arrived at to be morally right or wrong, independent of whether God, subscribes to them or not. And if that weren't the case, if things were right just because God says so, then literally anything could be morally right.
If there is no God, morality is relative. If there is no God, morality is subjective. If there is no God, there is no objective good, there's no objective evil. Because if there is no God, because it obviously takes a mind to understand good and evil, inanimate matter has no ability to distinguish between good and evil. Then if there is no God, it's obviously the human mind that creates right and wrong, which means morality is totally subjective, a matter of taste. Like, do you prefer broccoli to beans? Do you prefer abusing children to not abusing them? Do you prefer the rape of a woman to not raping a woman? It's just a taste, it's just a subjective opinion. Or it's a culture's opinion. But still, it's relative depending upon which culture you live in. I'm standing here appealing to the part of you that knows very well that objective evil is real. The abuse of an innocent child is always evil. I'm appealing to your conscience, which informs you that the rape of a woman is never good. And I'm pointing out to you, you know that you have to live as if, maybe not many, but a few morals are objective. Meaning by that, a few morals are independent of my opinion, your opinion, America's opinion, Nazi Germany's opinion, white South Africa's opinion. And you hold firmly to those objective values. But you're contradicting yourself. You're being an intellectual hypocrite if you're an atheist. Because if you're an atheist, you know there is no God who defines what's right and what's wrong. It's all relative. But you can't live it out. You have to grab for those objective morals. Why? Because you, as an atheist, still have a conscience, and your conscience convicts you that those morals, maybe not many, but at least a few, are very real and very objective. So I can promise you, sir, the moral argument is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that some type of God exists. Now, I have stated clearly to you, I understand the dilemma that you pointed out, that either God answers to a higher standard of good, or God arbitrarily defines what's right and wrong. But I still insist, sir, and I've just finished studying this very carefully, that there's a third option. And that third option is that the eternal God has a nature that is good and just. Which means, due to the fact that his eternal nature is good and just, whatever he wills is right, is good. And that's a third option that you need to consider. And it's not just a redoing of the first option. No. It's a very serious third option. There's an eternal God whose nature is good and just, which means that whatever he wills is good and right. And that is the basis for our understanding, with the consciences and the rational minds that God has given us, of what is right versus what is wrong.